Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, if a person does something that a Buddha does or would do, does that make them a Buddha themselves?
That's a fascinating question. I suppose that in some ways it does, because Buddhas do not do anything that is not skillful means, that is not for the purpose of enlightening sentient beings. But that person would not be a Buddha unless they have fully realized enlightenment.
So the difference is whether or not they intend to save sentient beings. But what if they are doing something for that specific reason? Can we say that they are not a Buddha?
You bring up an important point. It gets increasingly difficult to say that they are not a Buddha in that case.
I agree, it is a tough choice to make. What is the real difference between a sentient being who is fully enlightened and one who does everything that a fully enlightened being does? Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing Buddha nature. What is Buddha nature? What are its doctrinal roots? And how does it change over time? So, what is Buddha nature?
Buddha nature is a Mahayana Buddhist doctrinal concept, and it's known as Tathagata in Sanskrit, Fo Xing in Chinese, and Bussho in Japanese. Let's start by breaking down the word in Sanskrit and understanding what it means and what it is. Then we can talk about when it comes around in the texts, in what texts it comes around in, and so on. The first point I want to turn your attention to is the word Tathagata. This is another title for the Buddha, as we've said before, and it has two main translations from the Sanskrit. The first main translation is the thus gone one. The word refers to the suchness, or the thusness, or the tata of the Buddha. He has achieved enlightenment and nirvana without remainder. He is thus gone. In this present world, in this state that we are in, he is gone. The other translation is the thus come one. This translation refers to his having arisen in the world in response to the problem of suffering, the problem of delusion. You can see how these translations are doctrinally charged already. The first one speaks to his path in terms of the arhat ideal, which is to reach nirvana without remainder. Thus, the thus gone one translation is used by Theravada translations. He came and he went. The root of the word nirvana is to blow out or to be blown out, and Shakyamuni did just that, and we are in the state in this world right now where he has done that. However, on the other hand, the Mahayana will often use the translation thus come one, referring to the bodhisattva ideal. Shakyamuni, feeling compassion for all sentient beings, came into this world to save all of us from suffering. Keep these two interpretations in mind as we continue our discussion. Moving on to the suffix part of the word, Tathagata Garba, the suffix garba has a number of different meanings as well, and they are equally as doctrinally charged. Originally, among the older traditions, this word means containing. So the whole word would be containing a Tathagata, or womb of a Tathagata. The idea in these translations is that this Tathagata Garba is a Buddha in gestation or in waiting. It is not yet a realized Buddha, but one that will be realized in the future. The other type of translation, which comes later in the tradition, is that Garba means essence, or center, or nature, or sometimes even like matrix. And this refers to an understanding of it as being a characteristic of all sentient beings. It is later thought of, especially in Japan, as being a characteristic of all inanimate objects as well. This is not something that is possessed by a sentient being. It's not something that is impermanent. It's not something that implies a soul or a self that is unchanging over time. It is simply a property of beings in samsara, be they sentient or not, in the case of Japanese esoteric Buddhism. Now that we have discussed all of that, we can address the English translation of the word and its meaning. Buddha nature refers to the doctrine that all sentient beings, and even non-sentient ones in some cases, are possessed of this property of the Buddha. The idea is that this Buddha womb, or this Buddha container, will eventually develop into fully realized Buddhahood. Everybody and everything has this property, which essentially means that everybody will become a Buddha in the future. One final interpretation of this term is that if we are of the property of having a Buddha in waiting or in gestation, if that is at the center of our nature, we have a property of enlightenment about us, or we have a seed of enlightenment that we can nurture into Buddhahood in the future. This is the idea of original enlightenment. We have an originally enlightened nature that can be realized and brought back into our present state through practice and study.
What are Buddha nature's doctrinal roots?
This doctrine comes up in a number of Mahayana sutras called the Tathagata Sutras. It comes up in other texts implicitly and explicitly, but it is the actual subject of these sutras. There are 4 of them, and they are all the Buddha discussing the nature and implications of this Buddha nature to a different audience. These Tathagata Sutras are made up of the 4 sutras, the Tathagata Sutra, the Srimala Devi Sutra, the Angulimala Sutra, and the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra. Now, this is not the Pali one that we have read and discussed on this show, but it's actually the longer one that was written for the Mahayana. The idea of Buddha nature is a comparatively late development in the texts. Most of the sutras we read come from before the 3rd century Common Era, and this idea comes around in the 4th through 6th centuries Common Era. As with other Mahayana doctrines, the roots of the development of this one have to do with the problem of the Buddha's death. When the Buddha was aging and dying, there was a massive fear among the community about how to know the Dharma and how to become enlightened and how to achieve liberation in his absence. They thought that he was the only one who knew the Dharma and that he was the one revealing it for them, and that when he was gone, it would no longer be revealed to them until another Buddha came around. And they didn't really strongly believe in the possibility of another Buddha coming around anytime soon. Thus, we have developments such as the idea of Buddhahood being one of the levels of enlightenment. If the door to knowing Dharma is open to a larger number of individuals, and the penultimate type of enlightenment is not the Arhat ideal, but is instead now the enlightenment of the Bodhisattva and the Pratyeka Buddha and the fully realized Buddha, then it's not so bad when our historical Buddha passes away. Here we also have the answer to the question of how we can possibly know enlightenment if we do not ever knowingly come into contact with an enlightened person or a Buddha. If the concern is that we won't be able to know enlightenment unless an enlightened individual shows it to us or explains it to us, the answer that Buddha nature provides for us is that you are in proximity to enlightenment, and specifically Buddhahood, all the time. It is one with your own nature. This is but one of many doctrines that seeks to deal with the post-Shakyamuni world and answer the question of whether or not enlightenment and Buddhahood are possible for sentient beings after Shakyamuni has died. And if so, how these things, enlightenment and liberation and nirvana, are possible. Other doctrines in a similar vein are the doctrine of original enlightenment, like I mentioned before, of universal Buddhahood, of sentient and non-sentient beings, of skillful means, or upaya, which we've discussed on the show before, and of the perfection of wisdom through meditation. This is a specifically Mahayana development, which is known in Sanskrit as prajnaparamita, and there are many others that fall into this category as well.
How does Buddha nature change over time?
We have alluded a little bit to the ways that it evolves in Buddhist discourse, but we can discuss some more here. In the koan episodes, I have broken the development of Buddha nature doctrine into 3+1 stages. These stages are roughly chronological, but not quite. The first stage is the Buddha womb stage. In this stage, it's argued that there is the potential for Buddhahood in everybody, but not everybody actually realizes it. According to this doctrine, everybody has a Buddha in waiting or in gestation. It's part of our nature, but it's not necessarily a given that it will be realized. This is not far off from the earliest original doctrines of the marks of existence. These marks that we've talked about way earlier in the show are suffering, impermanence, emptiness, and later awakening, or enlightenment, or nirvana, or something in Sanskrit known as nirodha. This, by the way, is a Mahayana description of the marks of existence. Just so you know, it did come later than this 0 through 3rd century CE time period that we've been talking about. If you remember, the older traditions regard the marks of existence as just being emptiness, impermanence, and suffering, and they don't argue that one of the marks of existence is nirvana, or nirodha. That addition is a distinctly Mahayana development. It also helps us couch this discussion of Buddha nature in time. Our Buddha womb or Buddha seed is a derivation or a description of that quality of awakening. All sentient beings have this, and some of them realize it, not all of them. Some of them gestate and realize this Buddha throughout their immeasurable rebirths. Not everybody does this in this stage of understanding of the term. Some sentient beings, due to the law of large numbers, you might say, never do it at all. In this stage, it is not something that is possessed, attained, or taken, just like in all the other stages. It's actually just a property of reality. The second stage of understanding of this term, Buddha nature, is where the idea that some people will not reach Buddhahood is entirely done away with. And it's argued that, indeed, everybody will, given immeasurable time, achieve their Buddhahood. It is an inevitable occurrence, whereas before it was not inevitable. The reason for this change or this development is because of a Mahayana disagreement with the idea of the Achantaka. This is something that we've talked about ages ago on the show, but this is a sentient being who does not ever achieve enlightenment or Buddhahood for some reason. Many different commentaries on the sutras and on the doctrine have speculated as to why or how they do not reach enlightenment or Buddhahood, but at the end of the day, they don't, and it really doesn't matter the reason. However, it is a conscious reason in the older traditions. So the Achantakas do not realize enlightenment not due to a law of large numbers thing, but due to a conscious effort not to do so. This concept is rejected entirely by the Mahayana because of the increased importance afforded to Shraddha, or belief, or faith, something that we've talked about before as well. That Shraddha becomes the deciding factor in whether or not a being will attain Buddhahood. It becomes whether or not they believe that they will become a Buddha in the future. If they don't believe it, they won't. And if they do, then they will. In the third stage of understanding of Buddha nature, the concept is taken to highly esoteric levels. The idea develops, and the argument becomes that Buddha nature is actually one of the three bodies of the Buddha, and that this realm is the Buddha realm where that body is actively, constantly being realized. The body we are referring to is the Dharmakaya. The other bodies that we'll talk about in another episode are going to be the Nirmanakaya and the Sambhogakaya. This is his embodiment as the Dharma itself, this Dharmakaya. The Buddha and the Dharma are one according to their actual bodies. We often use the word corpus to refer to a body of texts or a body of teachings, and the word corpus has a Latin root that's cognate with like corporeal or like physical, like your body. And this is the exact same idea here. The Dharmakaya is the body of the Buddha and the body of his teachings. So that is to say that the universe that we exist in is the place where the Buddha's body is being realized as a teaching, if that makes sense.
It doesn't, but that's probably part of the point.
Yeah, no, this esoteric is so called just for that very reason, is because it's like secret and difficult to understand. In this case, where the universe that we live in is the Buddha's body and it's being realized through the teachings, it's regarded in this case as his remains in the world after he has come and gone, right? So this is realized in this realm because all of us and this realm we are in are non-dual with the Buddha's remains themselves, which is the Dharma. Thus, we have a non-dual nature with the Buddha himself, and we become Buddhas ourselves. It is just that nature gets paved over with defilements and ignorance from time to time. So we are this nature, we are non-dual with a Buddha, we're non-dual with the body of teachings of the Buddha, we're non-dual with the universe around us, but we sometimes have to practice and study to uncover it. We have to take a leap of faith or a leap of Shraddha in order to actually believe this and understand it. We have to be able to believe that we're going to become a Buddha, not knowing every single step of the path that we're going to take to get there, but just relying on our trust in the fact that we are non-dual with the world around us, and that the world around us is non-dual with the Dharma, and that the Dharma is non-dual with the Buddha, and so on. In this stage, it's also argued that non-sentient things, like rocks and trees and so on, have Buddha nature as well, because the realm has a non-dual nature with the body of the Buddha. So then, the +1 stage that I mentioned before is this idea of original enlightenment. The reason that this stage is a +1 stage and not a 4th stage is because technically this doctrine of original enlightenment is not the same as Buddha nature. but it is a derivative of it that comes around in China, not in India, but in China, in the development of Mahayana Buddhism. The idea in original enlightenment is that our original nature is enlightened, and thus through meditation and study and faith, we can remember that enlightenment and realize it in this world. We've talked about this doctrine before, and so for more on it, I highly recommend going back and listening to the Koan series, episode 3, and some of the other Mahayana-centric episodes that we've done that discuss this idea of Benjue, as it's known in Chinese, or Hongaku, as it's known in Japanese.
So this entire concept feels like a really interesting inverse to what you see, I don't know about the other Abrahamic religions, but at least in Christianity, the inverse of the idea of original sin. So whereas in Christianity, at least, the original nature of humanity is tainted, over here in Mahayana Buddhism, the original nature of people is a state of enlightenment.
That's exactly right. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because this is how we see massive questions of the moral norm in Buddhism as it develops in China and Japan. So we've talked about how upaya and things like that can be used to kind of post hoc justify some really awful behavior, especially the idea of this hidden bodhisattva, someone who is in the world where a lot of suffering is, doing things that kind of are involved with that suffering, strictly according to their own claims, a means of enlightening sentient beings by teaching them the nature of suffering and the nature of good and bad. We have talked about before how we don't really buy that, right? That's kind of not how the morality of Buddhism hits us and how we personally approach it. And so this original enlightenment is sort of foundational to that hidden bodhisattva idea and to that idea of arising in the world in the worst places, being kind of a not so great person according to the early Buddhist norms and morals, just as a means to enlighten them. This is part of the doctrine that leads to that discourse.
So this idea completely annihilates the idea of the Enchantika. Buddha nature and Enchantika seem like irreconcilably contradictory ideas.
They absolutely are. In fact, I don't think that there are any Mahayana Buddhists that are out there that still believe in the idea of the Enchantika today. The Enchantika is a very complicated idea that changes a lot over the development of Theravada Buddhism, because as we know, like, the Theravada is a very old school, but it's not the oldest. So the discussions that were happening about Echantikas were happening in the very earliest stages of the developments of what you might call sectarian or organized Buddhism right after the Buddha's death. We're talking like second and third generation disciples, right? These discussions were already happening by then, and Theravada didn't come up until a little bit later. And so Theravada has had its own very long discourse for the last 2,000 years on this idea of the Echantika, but it was picking up on a discourse that was already a couple hundred years old. And so there's those that said that the Echantika was just somebody who talks a lot of crap about Buddhism, someone that slanders the Dharma, someone that slanders the Buddha himself, someone that slanders the practitioners and the disciples. There's others that have said that it's characters who, like we just said, they don't realize enlightenment, whether it's a conscious idea or not. Then there's those that say that it is a conscious decision to not reach enlightenment, to not do the path of enlightenment. And this discourse, in some ways, is still going on today in Theravada circles, but because that's farther away from my expertise, I don't know what the current commentary on the idea is. I just know that in Mahayana, that was one of the earliest points of breakage from the Theravada tradition and from the older schools, is that they completely rejected this idea. And one of the ways that they made that rejection make sense is actually by saying, this is the real reason why one ought to be a good and moral person, because they are treating with a Buddha all the time. So if every single sentient being is or will be or has been a Buddha in some space or time, then you have to treat them with respect and reverence and deference and basically achieve all of the moral ideals that are set out in the early traditions. So they kind of argue that Achantikas make it so that it's impossible to really fully realize that moral ideal, and therefore they argue that Achantikas are not actually a thing. They don't actually exist. It was just kind of an early categorization of sentient beings that the Buddha later decided to empty out and to challenge and question in his own teachings. So they end up arguing that the Buddha's teachings changed over time as they became more subtle. We've talked about how that is one of the Mahayana arguments, is that later teachings are more complicated and more subtle and targeted towards a smarter and more advanced audience. But also, they have to argue that in order for them to reject some of these doctrines that they don't want to take from the earlier schools and from Theravada and so on.
I think that does it for this topic. Is there anything else you want to add?
Nope, that takes care of it for me.
All right, then. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on Buddha nature. Join us next week where we will discuss spirits and ghosts in Buddhism. If there is no soul in Buddhism, how do we account for spirits and ghosts? Why is this important? How does this affect how Buddhism is practiced across East Asia? We hope to see you there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.